Hey, how are you? This is John. Thanks for joining me for this second video in building the Hasegawa Mark 44 Ammoknight from Machining Krieger. In the last exciting installment, I'd gotten the interior parts done, and I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. A lot of times when I'm working on a kit and I look back at the parts, I may think, I wish I'd have done this or that different. And while anything that you build, that I build, can certainly be better, I'm pretty happy with this. So the inside is done, and it's time to move on to building the exterior of the kit. All right, the instructions cover a fairly standard breakdown for a mecha type kit. You build things in sub-assemblies: the feet, upper leg, lower leg, upper arm, lower arm, waist unit. So the exterior parts of the kit follow a fairly predictable sequence. I've gone ahead and built the parts, and there's absolutely no problems in construction. One thing I do recommend paying attention to is there are a few points in the instructions that require you to drill some holes for later parts to be mounted on. So make sure you look for this symbol that shows you where to drill. There's a couple of points on the legs that you need to do that. There's also, okay, I've got all the sub-assembly pieces arranged here. That, like I said, they go together very well. A few things to pay attention to. On these lower arm pieces, there's a rotating ball joint that you build, and you need to be careful when you're gluing the arm, the two halves of the arm, the forearm piece together. Make sure the glue doesn't impact that rotating joint. Also, in the previous segment, I'd mentioned needing to drill holes. These are the parts that go in where the holes are. So if you forget to drill the holes, you'll have to figure out where you want to mount these. But the parts look very good. They go together without problems. There's not any major seams in terms of gaps, but there are seams where you can definitely note where the joint is. Now, what I did was I put everything together. As I would put the part together, I would run a bead of Tamiya extra thin cement along the join and squeeze the part together. And when I saw a little bit of plastic coming up, melted plastic coming up from the joint, I'd set it aside, go to the next part. A couple of minutes later, I'd come back, squeeze it one more time, make sure it was together, to make sure there was a good join. If this were any other model, an aircraft model, anything like that, I would be a little more fussy about these seams. All I'm going to do is just sand them smooth. I'm not going to try and cover them over, because one of the features of the Machining Krieger genre is typically, it's not a requirement, but typically modelers texture the surface, which I'll be covering in a later segment. And so that texturing will cover up those seam lines. You don't want to have them real prominent, because they will stick through the texturing if you do. But as long as they're smooth, you'll be able to hide them with the later texturing. So keep that in mind. But it's a pretty cool looking kit. The gun is very unique. There's a clear part that goes on here. I'm going to wait until later to add that on, hopefully to give it some kind of glow effect in here when it comes to the painting stage. But the parts look pretty cool, and so I'm excited about this build. So next up in the process, we'll be adding texture. Okay, I'm going to be using two different things on this model to provide texture. I'm going to use Mr. Surfacer 500, which gives a lighter texture. It's not quite as bumpy, but it's definitely a noticeable surface texture with a lot of variation. And I'll also be using some Tamiya basic putty. Now, in the Machine Krieger kits I built in the past, I tended to use one or the other, just experimenting with different methods and different products. But some time ago, I saw a modeler who had built a Machine Krieger kit, and on the major surfaces of the model, the arms, the legs, so forth, they used something like Mr. Surfacer, which provided a lighter texture. But then on the armor pieces that were on, say, where the knees are, and the skirt armor, and some of the more prominent armor pieces, as well as just a few selective areas around the mobile suit, they used something that produced a heavier texture like Tamiya putty would. So I thought for this model I would, well, I guess there's no better way to say it, I thought I'd rip off their idea and provide a couple of different textures on the model, just to give it some different visual interest and see how I like that. And of course, for the purpose of video, it'll allow me to demonstrate putting both of these on. The reason for putting the texture on the Machine Krieger kits, according to Lincoln Wright, I sent him a question and I said, hey, is this a lore thing or is it just a stylistic thing? And he said it's a long story basically, but it's a lore thing. It's part of, I guess you'd say, the franchise itself, the story behind the franchise. So to stay true to that, I definitely want to do it. And I think I've mentioned him before, but certainly if you're building Machine Krieger or any kind of kits, I'd highly recommend checking out Lincoln Wright's work on YouTube and on Patreon. He goes by the name Paint on Plastic, so be sure and look him up and check him out on YouTube after you watch this video, because he's when it comes to Machine Krieger, he is to Machine Krieger what Shepard Payne was to monogram models in the 1970s, in my estimation. And if you know who Shepard Payne is, you know what that means. So be sure and check out his work. But let me go away for a second, and I'm going to get everything prepared, and I'll start adding texture to the Ammoknight. Okay, I'm going to start off adding texture with Mr. Surfacer 500 on one of the thigh parts and a foot part. I'm not going to show all the work. I'll spare you and me from having to film all of that. And I take my Mr. Surfacer straight from the bottle. I don't put it on a palette. I don't thin it. This bottle is kind of old. I've only got a little bit left. I'm going to need to get some more. And it's gotten a little thicker, which for these purposes is actually fine. It's probably down to about Mr. Surfacer 325 now. But all I do is I get an old brush that's seen better days. I put this piece of tape around it so I can remember that's the brush I use for stuff like this. And I just go into the pot and I get a blob like that. I don't try to be particularly neat about it. And I just start adding it on. Now initially it's going to be fairly smooth. But what I do as I'm adding it on, it will dry a little bit. And as it dries, I keep going over it and stippling it with the brush, which leaves essentially brush marks and provides texture to the model. And I don't know if that's going to show up very well, but it's a very gentle texture, which I kind of like. I want it to definitely have some surface texture, but I don't want it to necessarily always look like rough concrete. One of the builds I did recently, I gave it a much heavier texture over it. And I thought it looked pretty good, but I found just from my own personal tastes that using this Mr. Surfacer and the lighter texture that it gives, I just liked it better. It's very much, there's no right or wrong, I would say. It's what you prefer. And using Mr. Surfacer and Tamiya Putty, I use those because they're what I have. Any kind of surfacing, texturing product that you have, you can try and see how it works. So these are what I use because they're what I have and they're what I like. But anything that you have will work. Now, on the seam areas, all I've done after gluing them together and just using some Tamiya extra thin cement to get a good bond between them, I just used the edge of my hobby knife, my X-Acto knife, to scrape that down, and then some 600 grit sandpaper just to smooth it over a bit, because I knew that I would be coming back later with this Mr. Surfacer to texture right over it like that. So you don't have to be too fussy about the panel lines. Now, once it dries, I'll come back and check to make sure that a hint of that seam is not shown, because it can poke through, because Mr. Surfacer, when it dries, it shrinks up a little bit. So double check those seam lines, and if they are showing through, simply add some more texture to it, and that'll cover it up. On areas like this that have this panel and a seam line like that, generally what I do is I avoid the seam line, and sometimes I may even go a little bit short of it. I won't take it right up to it so that it stands out a little more. On some models that I've done, some Maschinen Krieger models I've done, I've actually left access hatches and things like that without any texturing on them. Again, just kind of personal preference to allow some visual difference between the surface around it and the panel. Almost to suggest that maybe that panel was a replacement panel, or it's a different type of material, you know, whatever your reasoning is in your brain, go with it. I just like the way it looks. Now, because this is part of the leg armor, in my brain, I'm thinking it needs to be textured, so I'm going to just fully texture this. But if it were, like I said, if it were more of an access panel, I would probably leave it without any texture on it, just because I like it that way. So you can see pretty quickly I've covered this part, and now I'll just set it up on a clamp and let it dry for a little bit. It dries fairly quick, and then I'll check it out afterwards to see if I want to add any more. Okay, to start the heavier texturing that I'd mentioned earlier using the Tamiya Basic Putty, I'm going to demonstrate it on the foot. This is one of the areas that I want to have that heavy texturing. Now what I've done is I've taken a mixing cup and I've put in a fairly good blob, to use a technical term, of Tamiya's Basic Putty, and I've thinned it with nail polish remover, just plain generic nail polish remover. It's acetone based. I always get the acetone based stuff, not they make stuff that has all of these healing and nourishing ingredients and all sorts of nonsense that, you know, it may work, but for modeling purposes, I figured just the plain acetone based nail polish remover would work best. And I make a very thick goop of it. It's thicker than Mr. Surfacer that I used earlier, and when it dries, it's going to have a lot more texture. And all I do is I get it on the end of this old brush here, and I just start stippling it on. Now, if you start doing this method and it's not giving you enough texture, you may have the mix a little too thin. So you may want to add some putty into it if it's too thin. One of the great things about adding texture to the model is if you feel like you get too much on, it's a real simple process to just use your hobby knife or some sanding sticks to knock it back a little bit. In fact, it can add additional visual interest if you make a few places smoother than other areas. Or when you're building it up with the putty, like this, when you're building up the texture, to deliberately build up some areas so that they're a little more textured than others. And you'll note I'm not being real neat about this. I'm just kind of dabbing it on, and if it's thicker in some areas than others, I'm okay with that. I'll probably give this 2 coats because, like I mentioned, I want this to be a much heavier texture with much more lumps and bumps on it, I guess you would say, than I can get with the Mr. Surfacer. So this may get additional coats. Now, you can, when I did this on the first time I did this method, I had watched, I mentioned him earlier, I watched Lincoln Wright's video on doing this, and he actually just puts the putty directly on his finger and just taps it on with the finger. Which, I mean, it works great. I just felt, I didn't like the feel of the putty on my finger. I know that sounds kind of needy, but it just weirded me out. So I came up with this. Well, I don't know if I came up with it. I can't be the originator of it, I'm sure. I haven't had an original thought in my life. But I knew I had used, on aircraft modeling, I had used nail polish remover previously to thin and to clean up Tamiya basic putty. So I knew I could make a mix like this of it. So that's why I do that. Basically because when I try to do it just straight from the tube with my finger, it just feels icky. So a bit of a confession there. Now you'll note how quick this stuff is drying. When I said I was going to put on 2 coats, I didn't mean I was going to set it down and wait half an hour and come back and do 2 coats. It dries fast enough that by the time you get from one side to the other, you can start adding more of it. Sometimes as it gets sticky, as you're putting some of it on, it will start pulling up the old stuff. If that happens, you can go back and correct it. I like to leave it because it adds additional surface texture, which I just find visually appealing. So continue on around the model and get all of the parts done this way, and then show you what it looks like when I'm done. All right, I have everything texturized. As I'd mentioned, I used the Tamiya putty on more prominent parts like the knee armor and this kidney thing here, as well as the feet, and the armor parts here, and then I've got other armor parts in a little box off camera that will make up more of the waist armor parts. This was Tamiya putty here also. The rest of it was Mr. Surfacer, so it's a little smoother texture. There's still definitely texture there, but it's not quite as prominent as the Tamiya Putty. Once I have, oh, one thing to note, this arm part, this little ball joint rotates. When you're putting texture on to this part, make sure you don't get any between the joint, or if you do, move it around a bit to keep it from freezing up, because you'll want that to be able to move. Even if you're going to glue it in position, you'll want that to be able to move so you can get it into the position you want. So be aware of that. The next step will be to prime everything. I plan to prime it in black. And you may be thinking, well, you've already put putty all over it. Isn't that primed? In a sense, it is. But one, I want everything to start off from the same tone, the same color underneath all of the base paint. So I'm going to prime it in black so that everything will start off the same, so that when I paint it, if there's anything that doesn't get full paint, it'll allow me to have some shadows and things like that, especially as I may end up modulating this. I'm not sure. I haven't decided yet. Plus, another reason to prime it is not all the parts got texture. These parts will need priming. This is, of course, the gun, and this is, I'm guessing, his fuel tank. Hangs under here. Or perhaps it's his lunchbox. I'm not sure which, but that'll go under there. So there's still quite a few parts that don't have anything on them yet that will need to be primed. But for that step, I'll put everything on one of my pterodactyl clamps. Some people call them alligator clamps. I call them pterodactyl clamps. Thanks, Carl. Next step, priming, and I'll show you what it looks like after the priming, and then the base painting. Okay, I have everything primed and ready for paint. I used Badger's Stynylrez black primer to prime everything, and I gave it a complete coat. Here's the main portion of the suit all put together. I'm not going to pop it open. I'll wait till I get it painted to do that. It's a pretty tight fit. There is a bit of a gap here that if I were building it closed, I would have forced that closed, glued it shut, but because I'm going to be leaving it open, I didn't bother doing that, and I just kind of sprayed from an angle to make sure that nothing got in there. And I just temporarily tacked this Homer Simpson face over the opening there. So now, with everything primed and ready to go, I'll begin the painting. All right, I've got everything painted up. Here's a few of the pieces, and going for a desert theme on this one. Okay, you know, I talked about Homer face earlier. Does that not look like a crab? Here's his eyes, big teeth, his claws. I'm telling you, it's a crab face. Anyway, I painted this up for a desert theme, and just gave it a good solid base coat. Nothing special about it. Went for full coverage, and I used Tamiya XF60 dark yellow. I like using, for base colors, I like using the paint right out of the pot, so that if I have to go back later and overspray something, I have plenty of it. I can use a little, you know, a little spare bottle to make a custom mix, but quite often that leaves paint left over that I may never use again. I may mix too much or too little. So I try to go with out of the bottle paint, but everything is this nice desert shade, and the next step will be to freehand some of the camouflage pattern on. I'm going to use an olive green kind of color, so that will be the next step in building the Ammoknight. Okay, I'm going to be doing a little bit of airbrushing now. I'm going to demonstrate it on this main body part. I almost called it a fuselage. The aircraft builder in me coming out. And what I'm going to be using for my camo color is XF81 Dark Green 2 RAF. I had looked at using olive green, to me as olive green, but it was a much too bright of a green. And for the look I'm going for, which is actually from inspired by a Somali MiG-21 that I sat in 1993 at Mogadishu's airport many, many years ago and many lifetimes ago. I thought that green would work a little better. I'm going to be thinning it with X20A, which is Tamiya's proprietary thinner for their paints. You can see I've decanted it into my own little squirt bottle. And I'm going to be using Badger's Extreme Patriot 105. It's got a 0.3 nozzle on it. I like this for freehand camo work because the needle is fine enough that I can get, as you'll see, I can get right in there and generally get a fairly good line without a lot of overspray. But it's large enough that when I need to cover a bigger area, it does it without too much problem. Plus, it's got this neat little feature here. It has this adjustment wheel, adjustment nozzle, that allows me to very finely control the amount of airflow coming out of the airbrush. So instead of having to always mess with the air pressure on the compressor, which is over behind me, I'm able to adjust it here and really get the flow down to exactly what I want. Now, normally I'm doing this in my airbrush station with my respirator on and all of the precautions, so please don't email me and say, oh, you shouldn't be doing it this way. I know, I'm doing it for my patrons. I love you. I'm willing to take the risk. For this just a little bit of airbrushing, it should be fine. So we'll hope. We'll know in the long run. So that's what I'm going to be using to put paint on the model. And then finally, as my guide for the camo, I'm going to be using as inspiration this pattern here, somewhat, not entirely, but I think on the upper part of the suit I'll use it for some inspiration in terms of the demarcation lines. I'm going to be going for a less modeled look than they show here and more of a solid coverage, but I'm just looking at where they have some of their demarcations for the camo, although I may reverse it because my old Army experience tells me that when you're putting camo on, you put dark camo in the lighter places and light camo in the darker places. So where they have the tops of the armor here, for example, around the skirt as the dark color, I'll probably reverse that. I may not. I may decide after I've started doing it that I like it better this way. My airbrushing a lot of times is rather loosey-goosey. I start off with a plan and sometimes I modify it depending on how things look. But I'll get started on this and show you how I do not only the base airbrushing, but I'll be doing what I call distressing the paint, which is a process I'll talk about in just a couple of segments. All right, I've got my paint loaded up in my airbrush and I've got everything. I've tested the flow on a piece of paper towel and I'm happy with it. Now, because I'm using my phone to film this, and you're probably hearing the compressor turning off and on in the background, because I'm using my phone to film this, I can only shoot 10 minutes of video at a time. So there may be jump cuts as I go through this process, because there's no retakes on this. So, and plus, I'm not going to film every bit of it. I just want to describe some of the key points of it. So with that in mind, let's get started. All right, I've thinned it to, it's probably 60%, 70% thinner, and the rest is paint. It's fairly thin, and I've set the airflow to be fairly low. Now when I'm doing a freehand camo, I don't start off going right into the edge where I want to draw the line in. I start inside to start getting the paint flowing, get a feel for how it is, and then work my way down to that. So let me just start that and establish some paint flow, and I'm very slowly pulling back on the trigger. There we go. Now I see how it's flowing, and I can start establishing my pattern. Now for this initial pattern, I'll get in there fairly tight because I want to make sure that I'm getting a good demarcation of what I want to do. And if you overspray a little bit, that's okay, because I can go back later with the lighter color and actually clean that edge up. You'd be surprised how many modelers' camouflage schemes could be greatly improved if they would simply go back with the lighter color and just clean up the edge. I've seen so many where they do a pretty good job of spraying on the demarcation. There's a bit of overspray, but if you just take the original base color and heavily thin it and get very tight in at the edge, then you'll be able to clean those lines up and get a really good look. I've had more than a few people that have kindly complimented me on some of the freehand work I've done on my aircraft. And they say, how do you get such tight lines? And I laugh and I say, well, actually I don't. I don't get such tight lines. I go kind of loosey-goosey, and then I go back and clean it up later. On this one, I'm being a little more careful about what I'm doing, because I figure if you guys are watching me do this on video, you expect me to be impressive. And I'm not. So I'm trying very carefully to get this looking good. But you see, there's the line, and that's tight enough that I'm happy with it. When the paint is fairly thin, especially with Tamiya, when the paint is fairly thin, you'll get a nice line like that. If you're getting a lot of sputtering and splatters with Tamiya, your paint is way too thick. Now you'll see here, right there on the shoulder, I'm going to have to go in at a different angle and kind of clean that up a little bit. Another thing to keep in mind when you're airbrushing camo schemes, it's in a lot of ways, it's all about the angles. Like for that right there, it may be better to turn the model and shoot it this way and get in real close. So as you're thinking, don't just go in blasting from an angle, because if you blast from this angle, if you shoot from this angle, you're going to get overspray that way. But if you point back into the camo, any overspray is going to go where you're later going to be painting. If you're wanting a really nice line like that, then shooting directly at it, if your paint is thinned right, is the better way to go on a flatter surface. On a curved surface, on compound curves, you want to shoot into it if possible. So that gives you a lot more flexibility with how you handle the camo pattern. So let me continue on around, get my paint flow going again. There we go. And I'm just going to continue back along this pattern. And I'm not trying to necessarily even follow the curves of the model. I want to break it up a bit. I mean, part of the reason for a camo scheme is to break up the outline. So I want to try and stay somewhat realistic in that regard. Now, here I'm continuing the pattern around, and I'm going to follow this curve here, although this is going to be under a piece of armor, so I'm not too worried about this. And you're probably wondering, why am I not holding it on a stick? When I'm painting like this, I like to twist it and turn it so many ways, and I find putting it on a stick just doesn't give me the flexibility to do so. So I just try to be really careful. Now, another thing, when you're camouflaging a pattern like this, you don't necessarily have to have it even on both sides. Camouflage patterns, especially if they're field applied, are they're often very quickly applied. So keep that in mind as you're working on it. All right, I had to change there, start filming again because I'd run through my 10 minutes. It goes by fairly quickly. You may notice right there I got some spidering. I started paying more attention to talking than painting, and I got that spider. It's one of the reasons you shoot into your camo, because I'll be able to easily cover that up with more paint. So that won't be a problem, plus later weathering will cover it. But I think this shows how easy it is to do a freehand camo. And I don't know if you've noticed, but my hands shake a little bit more than I would like to. As I've gotten older, there's just a little bit of shakiness to them. I've been to the doctor. It's nothing significant. It's nothing to worry about. It's just, I guess, just part of the aging process. But you know, I'm not super steady and precise. So don't be afraid to tackle freehand camo. It's a lot of fun, and I think it's one of the best ways to get around the curves of a model is to freehand it. Now, as you're doing the line, as you're establishing the line, you don't have to get it completely darkened in one pass. If you go over it several times, you can build it up, and that'll do several things. It'll make sure there's not a lot of overspray, but it'll also keep the paint really thin and not building up, or as I like to call it, damming up against the edge. A lot of times I can tell when modelers have shot paint really heavily because there'll be just the slightest, almost ridge where they paint. And for some reason, cameras seem to pick that up. So it can really show in a photo. When I'm photographing my models, or when I'm building my models, it's because of blogging and publishing and all of that, one of the foremost things in my mind is, will this photograph well? So that's often what I think about. Now here on the arm, I'm going to have to shoot a little back into the elbow gap there to get that filled in. Sometimes, if it's a really difficult gap to get to, I'll actually go back in later with a paintbrush and fill in an area that I missed, because it's not in general view. But if somebody's really closely examining the suit, I want to make sure that that little gap is covered up. So right down in there, I may go back later and fill it in. But now you can see I've established most of my perimeter for where I want the camo to be, and I'm going to go back and fill that in. I'm not going to film all of that because it would just be mind-numbingly boring for you and I. But I think you see how I establish that pattern. I'm going to go back and film it, or I'm going to go back and fill it in, and then when I'm done with that, I'll come back and show you a process that I call distressing. And it's not that the process is distressing. I call the process distressing. Never mind. You'll see when I do it. All right, to quote model making guru, back in a moment. Okay, I have the camo applied, and you'll notice that I've gone all around the model and just put in the pattern where I thought it would work. This was a highlight area, so I gave that some shadow. This would have been highlighted, so I gave that some shadow with the green. Same way here. The areas that would be in shadow, I left light. So I like the way it looks. I didn't try to be too terribly opaque about my application because, one, in my mind, this is a field applied camo, so they're more interested in breaking up the outline than anything else. And two, this process that I'm going to go through here in a minute that I call distressing. Now, I don't know that I invented that term. I don't know when I started calling it that. I don't know if I heard it, if that's what it came up with in my mind, but I call it distressing, which is a process of breaking up the monotone appearance of the color. If you look at any military vehicle that's been out in the sun for any length of time, that's been used for any length of time, the color is not uniform overall unless it's highly maintained and highly polished. I mean, the Thunderbirds, yeah. The Blue Angels, their colors are always spot on perfect. But you look at a tank, you look at a combat aircraft, it's patchy, it's splotchy. So this process of what I call distressing is going to try and replicate that. I'll show you how I do that with the airbrush here in a moment. Prepare the paint for distressing the green camo color. I start off with just the paint that I had in the cup from painting it. There's still a little bit left in there. It's already fairly thin. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in some Tamiya XF55 Deck Tan. I like using this color as my distressing color because it will desaturate it a little bit, but it gives it a faded look. And I will use this color as the fading color in every color of a camo scheme. So I'll actually go back, and the XF60 that I used earlier for the base color, I'll actually use a mix of this XF55 and this to distress that. But I wanted to show the green because hopefully it'll be a little more dramatic in terms of visibility. Now, one of the things that I do, another one of the things that I do when distressing the paint is I want it to be very thin because you'll see in a moment as I apply it, I want to have great control. So I fill the color cup up about 3/4. That's really thin paint right there. And then I'm just going to get a good brush full of this XF55 Deck Tan, and I'm just going to mix it in like that, and I'm eyeballing it. There doesn't have to be a precise color that you're going for. You're just wanting it to be lighter. To what degree it's lighter is up to you. I think I'm going to do one more brush full because I'm just looking for, there we go, that's what I'm looking for. Now, you can actually do this process, like if I'm doing a very dark color, like a dark sea blue, I may do this process 2 or 3 times on a model just to get a nice effect of fading all over it. You don't have to do just one color like this. You can do it multiple times, but that's how I prepare the paint in the color cup. And I put the lid back on because that stuff will slosh out, and I'll show you how I apply it to the model. I've got my paint ready in my color cup, and I'm going to establish the flow off camera here, and I'll begin just a process I call, in terms of application, I call scribbling, because my hand motion is very much like a child scribbling with crayons, though in a little more precise fashion. And I'm not being careful in terms of only highlighting the center of panel lines. I'm going over panel lines. I'm going over all the features. I mean, if you do want to highlight specific areas, if you do want to introduce modulation, that's fine. Whatever will break up the pattern and make it look interesting. But the goal here is just to give some variation to the surface in terms of color, to break up that monotony. Now, you can shoot further out if you want to get an area spotted. You can get in closer to get a more precise application. And I go over areas multiple times to make sure that it doesn't look too contrived. Because the paint is so thin, I can get right up to the edge of the demarcation, and if a little bit spills over, as long as I don't concentrate in that area too long, it won't show. And because these two colors, in terms of what I'm going to use for the distress coat on both colors, are so similar, if a little bit spills over, it's not going to be a problem. Now, this will fade it, which is what I want. But take that into account when you're applying this. How faded do you want the paint to look? Now, I really hope this is coming out on camera, because I'm not going to get a chance to do a second take. So if this is all blurry and out of focus, I do apologize. And as I go along, I'll maybe add some more squiggles in some areas than others. It's a very random process. You do have to keep your hand moving. If you linger in one area too long, because the paint is so thin, you may get some spidering, some spider webs. If that happens, keep going, and then later on simply come back with the base color, overpaint that one area, and then go through the distressing process in that one area one more time. And that should correct any issues that you have with spidering or splattering or anything like that. Now, if you start doing it and you realize you're not getting the results you want, maybe it's your color's too light or too dark, just adjust the paint in your color cup. Add more paint, add more of the light color, add more of the dark color, add more thinner if you feel like it's not thin enough for you. Whatever works for the situation you're doing. It's very much an eyeball process. You eyeball it and do it in a way that makes sense to you and the goal you have for the model's finish. And I'm sorry if I sound odd in the way I'm talking. Whoops, I bumped the camera. I'm sorry if I sound odd in the way I'm talking, but I've never actually airbrushed and talked at the same time. So this is using up all of my brain capacity to make this happen. Okay, Now you can see I've got a little bit of spidering there that I'll go back and fix. I got a little carried away. Some of the imperfections that you may see will be covered up by later weathering. I could probably leave that in, and streaking would take care of it. I might even be able to go in and just blend it in as it is now. Yeah, I can blend that line right in, and it's good to go. You may also want to, like where these bolts are, you may want to do some highlighting of those, just to introduce a little bit of modulation. This is a very flexible technique that can accomplish a lot of things at one time, so experiment with it. But I like it. I like the way it works. I've done it on literally hundreds of aircraft, and I'm really happy with the results that it yields. Okay, and he is painted. I went ahead and did the rest of the model using the same technique that I demonstrated on this portion. I ended up using deck tan, Tamiya XF55 deck tan, right out of the bottle to do the distressing on the tan color. There wasn't enough contrast for my taste when I mixed it with the desert yellow, so I just went with the straight XF55 tan to get the distressing. And I do that a lot on lighter colors. I don't know why. Sometimes I think I can get mixes to work that my experience has told me probably won't, but it was worth a try. Now he's only loosely assembled right now. The arms are in pretty good, but the legs are just set up in there for the purpose of taking the photo. The legs in his sumo underwear there. But you'll see that the way I painted, let me move this out of the way. You'll see that the pattern I painted, I tried to get areas that I thought would be in highlight as it moved around, to kind of use that theory that I talked about earlier from my old Army days. I got the tops of the feet at the front, got the backs of the legs a little bit. I got this portion here. I left this alone because I knew it would be under the armor. So, and then on the rest of it, I drew some of the pattern in there. I got it on the arms, the lower part of the armor here, because I thought that's where most of the light would be hitting. Put it in there, distressed that. You can, hopefully you can see, let me put that up to the camera. Hopefully you can see that distressing. It's not I didn't do it in a dramatic way. You can do it in a dramatic way. I did it in a fairly subtle way, as, like I said earlier, I believe, as a basis for later steps to come. I'll hand paint the smoke discharge canisters another color. I haven't decided yet what I'm going to paint them, but I'll paint them another color. And one thing I am doing, as I mentioned in one of the other earlier segments, the scheme, the color scheme here is I'm drawing that from a Somali MiG-21 that I had the misfortune of being there, but the fortune of sitting in when I was in Somalia back in 1993. And so, sticking with the MiG theme, I've decided to give his faceplate a green coat of paint. It may look a little silly. I'm okay with that. I know what the inspiration is. I've always wanted to build the MiG that I sat in, but I've never been able to bring myself to do it. So this build, it represents a little bit of a of actually doing that in a way that I'm okay with. But I've got the faceplate for Homer's mouth, painted green. And there's a piece of armor that's going to go right over this section here. And I painted it green also because, again, sticking with the MiG theme, if you've ever seen any MiG-21s, they have a green panel on the top of the vertical stabilizer. And so this is kind of representing the green at the back of it. So that's my thinking there. And then I've got a couple of more pieces of armor that have been painted that will go over the shoulders. I'm leaving them off for now. When I get full into the weathering, I'll probably mount them on so that I can do it all organically. For the next steps, my plan is to paint the pilot figure that comes with the kit. It's a really nice sculpt, and I'm hoping that I'm not sure if painting in the larger scale will make the face easier or smaller. I've only painted one face at 1/20th scale. I'm not an experienced figure painter, but I like the look of this, and my plan is to have the model on a base on one side and the dude standing next to it like he's just got back from a mission and he's just contemplating the day before he goes to chow or whatever it is they do in the Maschinen Krieger world. I plan to do what you and I probably both will hope will be a shorter video on painting this guy. If the next chapter in this series is painting the figure and building the base, you'll know that I felt like I did those fairly well. If the next chapter is weathering and finishing the model, you'll know that I wasn't real pleased with the way the figure and the base turned out, and I just didn't bother filming them. Because I don't know that there's any value for you or me in demonstrating something that stinks. But I'll get this guy done and get a base done, and we'll see how that looks. All right, I'm going to call that a wrap, to use the language of film making. I'm happy with how this turned out. It accomplished what I wanted, which was to sort of allude to a specific piece of military hardware. And I like how the distressing turned out. I like how the texturing turned out, so I'm pretty happy with this guy at this point. The next steps, the next step is going to be to give him a gloss coat and add the decals. I'm probably not gonna film that because I don't know that there's a whole lot of value in that, and this is I've probably stretched this out a little long. So if you're still watching this, thank you, bless you for doing so. The next segment with regards to I keep wanting to call it a mobile suit. The next section with the armored suit will be the weathering, and I plan to weather this fairly heavily and make use of quite a few techniques. So I'll document that, though I'm hoping to do it in a much shorter fashion than it took to demonstrate the airbrushing. So that's how he looks at this stage. Thank you so much for watching this. Thank you more for being a patron. This is a patron exclusive video, so you and a few others are the only ones who should see this. Your support means a whole lot to me. It's what keeps me going. It allows me to get the supplies that I need and make this happen. Hopefully I'll be having some equipment upgrades coming later in the year, which will improve the quality of these videos. If you do enjoy this and you want to share it, please share the Patreon page that this is on, not the video itself. That would help me out immensely. So the Ammoknight is painted, and next up, the weathering. So again, thank you for being a patron. Thank you for being a supporter. I hope this inspires you to enjoy your own building and try new things. This is certainly something fairly new for me. I hope it encourages you to have fun with the hobby, because I've said it before and I'll say it again. If you're not having fun, you're doing something wrong. So have a great day, and happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.